Thanks for tuning into this episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. If you know anybody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. And go ahead and give it a review if you enjoy the podcast on your app of choice. In the autumn of 1914, war had already engulfed Europe, but its reach extended far beyond the Western Front. The Ottoman Empire, weakened but still a power in its own right, cast its lot with the Central Powers, opening a vast new battleground stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Anatolia. Britain, with its empire stretching across continents, moved quickly to secure its most vital interests. Nowhere was this urgency greater than in the Persian Gulf, where British-controlled oil fields fueled the navy that kept the empire alive. What began as a limited operation to protect these resources soon spiraled into something far greater. British forces pushed deep into Mesopotamia, first securing Basra, then advancing up the Tigris and Euphrates. Each gain demanded another. Each new position seemed to require the capture of the next. Caution soon gave way to overconfidence. Commanders in the field, believing their troops superior, underestimated the resilience of the Ottoman defenders. Politicians in London, eager for a victory in the East, approved plans without fully grasping the logistical demands of the campaign. A force that had been sent to guard British interests now found itself hundreds of miles from its supply base, marching toward an enemy stronghold with no clear way back. The consequences of what happened next shaped the Middle East for the next century. The failure of this campaign exposed the cracks in Britain's imperial strategy, forcing a reckoning that altered its approach to warfare in the region. The suffering of the men trapped in its final act sent shockwaves through the British public, sparking outrage, political upheaval, and military reform. And when the war finally ended, the victors carved new nations from the corpse of the Ottoman Empire, including one that would become Iraq, a country whose borders, politics, and conflicts would all bear the scars of this ill-fated campaign. This was not just a siege. It was a turning point, a lesson in hubris, a warning ignored, and its legacy still lingers today. Let's now experience the siege of Kut-Al-Amara.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 21, The Siege of Kut-Al-Amara, from the 8th of December, 1915, to the 29th of April, 1916. British forces, between 25,000 and 45,000 troops. Turkish forces, between 25,000 and 80,000 troops. Kut was the longest unrelieved siege ever suffered by a British force, and its fall sent shockwaves through the empire. It wasn't just a battlefield defeat, it was a total unraveling. The loss shattered illusions of invincibility, exposed the failures of British command, and forced a reckoning that reshaped military strategy and political leadership in the middle of the Great War.
In November 1914, as the Ottoman Empire threw its lot in with the Central Powers, Britain responded with cold efficiency. Indian Expeditionary Force D was deployed to the Persian Gulf, its arrival signaling British resolve in a theater that would soon become a crucible of endurance, ambition, and bloodshed. The official story was that Force D had been sent to safeguard British oil interests. The reality was far starker. London had no intention of allowing whispers of Ottoman-led rebellion to take root amongst its Muslim subjects in India. This was a mission of deterrence, a show of strength meant to crush unrest before it ever had the chance to ignite. With barely a fight, British and Indian troops of the 6th Indian Division took Basra. A few shells, a brief engagement, and the city was theirs. From there, they pushed forward, methodical and unchallenged, up the Shatt al-Arab. Their next target? Korna, the strategic junction where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet, key terrain that would shape the campaign to come. At Shaiba, south of Kurna, the fight was short but fierce. Turkish resistance was broken, swept aside by disciplined fire and an unyielding advance. The victory secured British dominance over the Gulf region, and soon enough, local Arab tribes came forward with declarations of loyalty. Whether genuine or made out of self-preservation, Britain now had its foothold. By January of 1915, the immediate objectives had been met. Basra was secure, the oil fields protected, and Turkish forces in retreat. Yet rather than consolidate their position, the campaign began to take on an aimless momentum, a dangerous drift into overextension, driven by ambition, miscommunication, and the illusion of invincibility. Viceroy Lord Hardinge arrived at the front in March and saw the problem at once. A single division was not enough, not to hold Basra, not to deter unrest, and not to enforce British authority. Reinforcements were sent, the 12th Division. Now the campaign was under the command of Lieutenant General Sir John Nixon, a man who believed security could only be achieved by pushing ever deeper into Mesopotamia. Nixon saw danger in every direction and acted accordingly. His forces secured the oil fields on the Karun River in Persia, ensuring the lifeblood of the war machine would not fall into enemy hands. Yet he wasn't content to hold ground. He advanced up both the Tigris and the Euphrates, convinced that every mile left unoccupied was a potential Turkish attack route. His army was moving, always moving, deeper into the unknown. Every gain demanded another. Every occupied town became the new vulnerable point, compelling Nixon to push further, always chasing this illusion of a secure position. It was a strategy that ignored the fundamental rule of war. An army stretched too thin is an army doomed to collapse. Back in India, Harding and General Duff took Nixon's reports at face value. Each advance, they were told, was necessary. Every new town occupied was essential. Yet the brutal arithmetic of logistics was ignored. Nixon's forces moved ever farther from Basra, but the supply lines didn't grow with them. They were marching toward the limits of endurance, toward a breaking point no one in command seemed willing to accept. Nixon had reached too far. His army was stretched to the breaking point, its reach exceeding its grasp. And when the moment of reckoning came, the blade fell. In November of 1915, Kut-Al-Amara fell into British hands after a masterfully executed operation. It was a victory that should have been a warning, an advance won with skill, but at a cost that could not be ignored. Yet instead of consolidating, Nixon and the Indian authorities set their sights on the great prize. Baghdad, the jewel of Mesopotamia. The name alone was intoxicating. But an operation of this scale could not be ordered from the field. The decision lay with London. Harding and Duff fed London a vision of unstoppable momentum. The Turks, they claimed, were inferior soldiers, already broken and demoralized. Nixon's men, on the other hand, had taken everything Mesopotamia had thrown at them and kept moving forward. They had done so well, with so little support, and still they had won. What could possibly stop them now? Baghdad was too tempting, too glorious a prize. The war cabinet, seduced by the idea of a triumph that would echo across the empire, gave the order, and the assault was on. Neither London nor Delhi bothered to ask the man who would actually lead the attack. Major General Charles Townshend, commander of the 6th Division, architect of their victories, the man in the trenches, the man who knew the battlefield, was given the order to march on Baghdad. But he saw what those in distant offices refused to acknowledge. For months, Townshend had pleaded for reinforcements, for transport, for the means to make victory possible. Yet his warnings fell on deaf ears. Nixon did not listen. Townshend knew the truth. His division was too small, too exhausted, too far from supply lines to take on a dug-in enemy with superior numbers. He raised the alarm, but Nixon ignored him. His words never even reached India. They certainly never reached London, and no reinforcements came. Still, Townshend led his men forward. At Ctesiphon, just outside Baghdad, they fought like demons. For a moment, it seemed as if victory was within reach, but war does not reward reckless ambition. The cost was staggering. 5,000 casualties. His men were spent. The push to Baghdad died right there, and Townshend gave the only order left to give: to withdraw. The wounded were pulled out by the river. Those still standing fought their way back down the Tigris, and on the 5th of December, the 6th Division entered Kut, battered but intact. 3 days later, that noose tightened. The Turks had surrounded them. Armchair critics would later argue that Townsend should have kept moving, but those men had never felt exhaustion like his troops had. They'd never seen the open, indefensible terrain beyond Kut, and they had never been handed a direct order from Nixon to hold the town. Townsend made the only call he could. Kut was defensible. It had supplies. It was the only place he could hold out. There was no other option. The Turks wasted no time. By mid-December, their trenches closed in and they launched wave after wave against the defenses of Kut. Leading them was a veteran of European battlefields, German Field Marshal Kalmar von der Goltz, a master of siege warfare, a man who had spent years shaping the Ottoman military into a force capable of standing against the British Empire. 3 times Turkish troops charged the British lines. 3 times they were thrown back. Von der Goltz saw the writing on the wall. He didn't need another bloody assault. He would simply wait. He would starve them out. And the siege of Kut had begun. Townsend knew rations would not last forever. He forced some of the town's inhabitants to leave, but not enough of them. He hesitated, perhaps believing relief would come, perhaps unwilling to turn out too many civilians into the unknown. But that hesitation would cost him. Another miscalculation. A full, ruthless search for supplies was needed from the start, but it was not done. Not then. Not until hunger had already begun to take hold. By the time the food situation was reassessed, it was far too late. When the first relief effort failed in January of 1916, reality set in. Townsend's men scoured every corner of Kut for food. What they found was simply not enough. The reckoning had begun. Had the food been counted properly, had the rations been cut sooner, had every scrap been accounted for from the beginning, they could have held longer. The defenders could have fought with clearer knowledge of when relief would be needed, but none of that happened. The suffering would only deepen. By December of 1915, Nixon was gone, felled not by enemy fire, but by sickness. He was carried out of the theater, leaving behind the disaster he had helped create. In his place, General George Goring took command of Force D. He had one task: break the siege. Goring struck fast, too fast. His first attack nearly shattered the Turkish lines, but haste left the operation disorganized. Victory was within reach, and then it was gone. When word reached him that new food stores had been found in Kut, Goring took his time. This time, the attack would be precise, it would be calculated, and it would succeed. His forces targeted the weak point, a thinner Turkish line south of the Tigris. The plan was solid. Scouts reported an opportunity. A major Turkish fort lay empty, unoccupied, but hesitation crept in. The moment passed. The Turks saw the threat and filled the gap. What could have been a breakthrough became another bloody stalemate. Goring hesitated when he should have struck. A single decisive push could have shattered the line. Instead, it held, and the relief effort failed. Townsend had no choice. Half rations. The men tightened their belts, but the hunger gnawed deeper. Desperation forced innovation. For the first time in history, supplies were dropped by air to a besieged army. But there were too few planes, too few supplies, and the Mesopotamian winds refused to cooperate. The effort was daring, but it couldn't stop the starvation. Townsend's radio still worked. He could still send messages. He began pressing for negotiations while his men could still fight, while they could still be seen as a threat, because the window was closing. His pleas were ignored. April came. The final attempt to break the siege slammed against an unshakable wall. The Turks had spent months reinforcing their defenses, and the British never had a chance. Inside Kut, no breakout attempt was made. It was discussed, it was considered, and then it was abandoned. Goring believed his forces could break through, but he was wrong. The cost of failure was too high. Too many men would be lost. Too many wounded left behind. The risk was unbearable. By mid-April, reality could no longer be ignored. Townsend was finally given permission to negotiate. His opponent was now Khalil Pasha, the man who had taken command after von der Goltz's death. Townsend had no leverage. He had nothing left to offer. He made his pitch. Let his men leave, unarmed, never to fight in the Middle East again. When that failed, he played his last card, £1 million for the lives of his men. Khalil's answer was cold and final. Quote, "Tell him to keep his money. I have lost 10,000 men." End quote. Khalil Pasha would grant no terms for the men of Kut, no safe passage, no parole. The only offer he made was for Townsend himself, to travel alone to Constantinople and plead his case before the Ottoman government. It was not a negotiation, it was an insult. The game was over. On the 29th of April 1916, after 149 days of hunger and hopelessness, the garrison of Kut surrendered. Never before had a British force endured such a long siege without relief. 149 days, and for what? The men of the 6th Division did not go home. They were marched out of Kut, not to safety, but into captivity. They trudged north, weakened by starvation, many already half dead. They fell in the dust along the way. They died in the prison camps of Anatolia. They had fought to the last, and they were thrown away. Townsend, the man who had commanded them, suffered no such fate. He was taken to a comfortable villa near Constantinople, kept in relative luxury under house arrest. From there, he sent letters, appealed to the Turkish government, tried to ease the suffering of his men, but it changed nothing. After the war, the contrast between commander and soldier was not forgotten. The men of the 6th Division had starved in captivity, while their general had lived in comfort. Townsend returned to Britain, but the stain of Kut never left him. He died in disgrace in 1924, his reputation broken, his name spoken with contempt. But during the war, the British public did not yet know the truth. For a time, he was celebrated as the hero of Kut, a title that would not last. The truth was more complicated. Townsend had fought well, he had led well, he had done nearly everything he could. But war doesn't care for effort, only results. Had the supplies been counted properly, had the relief efforts been timed better, had the realities of war been grasped sooner, perhaps the outcome could have been different. But after January 1916, none of it mattered. The Turkish defenses downriver were too strong. The 6th Division was already doomed. The dream of Baghdad had turned to dust. The loss of Kut was not just a military failure, it was a humiliation. The British public, previously indifferent to the Mesopotamian campaign, was now paying attention. The men who survived, those who limped back from Turkish captivity, told their stories. They spoke of hunger, disease, mismanagement, and the outrage was immediate. The government was forced to act, launching the Mesopotamia Commission to investigate the disaster. The commission uncovered the rot at the heart of the campaign: India's poor oversight, the failure of logistics, the primitive port at Basra choking the flow of supplies, the lack of transport leaving men in the field without food, ammunition, or medicine, and worst of all, the utter neglect of the wounded. The British public, now fully aware of the horror, was furious. The fury reached Westminster. The failures in Mesopotamia, exposed in full detail, helped bring down the government of H.H. Asquith, and in his place, David Lloyd George took over. Kut had not just been a military disaster, it had helped change the leadership of the empire itself. Yet justice did not come for those who had led the campaign to failure. General John Nixon, the man who had stretched his army to the breaking point, faced no punishment. Viceroy Harding, who had signed off on every reckless advance, remained untouchable. Those who had suffered the most paid the price. Those who had sent them to suffer walked free. The outrage forced action. At last, proper transport, proper supply lines, proper medical care were established. But a year too late for the men of Kut, but not for the campaign that remained. By late 1916, new leadership arrived. General Sir Stanley Maude took command, and with him came discipline, planning, and the resources that Nixon had never secured. The following spring, he did what Townsend could not. He took Baghdad. The guns fell silent, but the war did not end. It only transformed. The victors did not leave. They could not. The League of Nations, in its wisdom or its folly, handed Mesopotamia to the British, not as liberators, but as rulers. The desert had drunk the blood of thousands. The rivers had carried away the corpses of the fallen. And yet, from this ruin, a new line was drawn upon the earth. A nation was willed into existence, not by its people, not by its warriors, but by the hands of men in distant halls who had never choked on its dust, never starved within its walls, never buried their dead beneath its sun. This was no triumph, no grand imperial conquest. It was the birth of a nation in the shadow of war, and its name, Iraq, was written in suffering, and the suffering was far from over.